The thermometer inside read 68 degrees, while the one outside Angus McTavish's curved timber structure showed 14 below zero. What happened in the 18 months before that impossible winter morning would change how trappers survived in the northern Rockies. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale of mountain survival is even more remarkable than this one. The cabin door wouldn't open from the inside. Angus McTavish pushed harder, confused, then heard the scrape of ice against wood. He stepped back and examined the door frame in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the oiled paper window. Frost had sealed the door shut during the night. He grabbed his knife and chipped at the ice until the door finally swung outward. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He had experienced brutal winters before, but this morning felt different. The air burned his lungs. His breath crystallized instantly into clouds that hung motionless in the still air. He stepped outside to check the thermometer he and Fergus Callahan had mounted on the exterior wall the previous autumn. The mercury had dropped below the lowest marking. Angus estimated it was at least 20 below zero, possibly colder. He turned to call back inside to Fergus, then stopped. Something felt wrong. Fergus always woke before dawn. He should have already been stoking the fire, heating coffee, preparing for the day's trapline run. The cabin behind Angus was silent. Angus went back inside. The interior was bitterly cold despite the fire they had banked the night before. The coals in the stone fireplace had died completely, which was unusual. They typically maintained embers through the night. He looked toward Fergus's sleeping platform in the corner. Fergus lay motionless under his blankets, positioned exactly as he had been when Angus had fallen asleep. Angus crossed the small cabin in 3 steps. He touched Fergus's shoulder. The body was rigid. Angus pulled back the blankets. Fergus Callahan was dead, frozen solid during the night. His eyes were closed. His expression was peaceful. There was no sign of struggle or distress. He had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Angus stood in the freezing cabin, looking at his partner's body, trying to understand what had happened. They had firewood stacked against the wall. The fireplace was functional. They had adequate blankets. Fergus was an experienced mountain man who had survived 9 winters in the Rockies. Men like Fergus didn't freeze to death inside their own cabins. But Fergus had frozen anyway. Angus walked to the woodpile and selected several logs. He rebuilt the fire, working mechanically. The kindling caught. The flames grew. Within 20 minutes, the fire was roaring. Angus sat on his own sleeping platform and watched the flames. The cabin began to warm, but slowly. He noticed how the heat seemed to rise directly to the roof and disappear. He felt cold air coming through gaps in the log chinking. The stone fireplace radiated some warmth, but most of the heat went up the chimney. The cabin's interior temperature was increasing, but it required constant feeding of the fire to maintain even minimal comfort. Angus looked at Fergus's body again. His partner had frozen to death less than 10 feet from a fireplace with adequate fuel. The cabin they had built, the cabin they had trusted to protect them, had failed in the most fundamental way possible. That failure would haunt Angus McTavish for the next 18 months and drive him to solve a problem that had killed trappers throughout the northern mountains since white men had first entered the region. Angus buried Fergus on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had trapped together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 2 days of building fires on the burial site to soften the earth enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones and returned to the cabin alone. He couldn't leave, not yet. The trap lines still needed checking. The pelts they had already collected needed processing. More than that, Angus needed to understand what had killed his partner. The question consumed him. He started by examining the cabin with new eyes. The structure was typical of Rocky Mountain trapper construction circa 1841. Logs notched at corners, stacked horizontally, chinked with moss and mud. A single room measuring 12 feet by 14 feet. One door, one window, a stone fireplace on the north wall. The roof was pole rafters covered with bark and a layer of sod. Angus began measuring. He used a thermometer Fergus had brought from St. Louis, an expensive instrument that most trappers considered unnecessary. Angus placed it at various locations inside the cabin and recorded the temperatures throughout the day. The results troubled him. With a large fire burning, the area directly in front of the fireplace reached a comfortable 70 degrees. But 6 feet away, near the sleeping platforms, the temperature was 45 degrees. Near the door, it dropped to 38 degrees. The cabin had no uniform warmth. It had hot zones and cold zones, and the cold zones were deadly. He examined the firewood consumption. In a 24-hour period, maintaining even minimal interior warmth required burning through approximately 40 pounds of split wood. That meant processing and hauling enormous quantities of fuel throughout the winter. A trapper working alone couldn't maintain that pace while also running trap lines. Angus studied the fire itself. He watched how the flames drew air from gaps in the walls, creating drafts. He observed how heat rose directly to the roof, where it escaped through gaps in the bark covering. He calculated that perhaps 20% of the fire's heat actually warmed the living space. The rest was lost to the exterior. He tested the walls by placing his hand against the interior log surfaces on cold mornings. The logs themselves were cold to the touch. They conducted exterior cold directly into the cabin. The chinking between logs had gaps where wind penetrated. Some gaps were obvious, others were invisible but detectable by the cold airflow. Over the next month, as he continued trapping to salvage the season's work, Angus visited other cabins in the region. He talked to trappers about their heating methods. Everyone had the same problems: enormous wood consumption, cold sleeping areas, drafts, and the constant danger of fires going out during the night. 2 trappers Angus spoke with mentioned losing partners to cold. One man described waking to find his companion dead, frozen in his sleep, exactly like Fergus. The other described a trapper who had survived but lost 3 toes to frostbite, suffered inside his own cabin during a particularly brutal cold snap. The problem wasn't individual failure, it was systematic. The way trappers built cabins was fundamentally inadequate for the extreme cold of northern Rocky Mountain winters. Spring came late in 1842. Angus remained in the mountains through April, processing the season's pelts and thinking about cabin construction. When the high country trails finally cleared in early May, he packed his furs and headed to Fort Union, the major trading post on the upper Missouri River. The journey took 11 days. Angus traveled alone, leading 2 pack horses loaded with beaver pelts. During those long days of riding, he thought constantly about heat and cold, about air and wood, about how to build a structure that could maintain warmth without consuming impossible quantities of fuel. At Fort Union, he sold his pelts for a reasonable price. The fur trade was declining as fashion shifted away from beaver felt hats, but quality pelts still commanded decent money. Angus collected his payment and immediately began a different kind of transaction. He spent 3 days studying the fort's construction. Fort Union was built for permanence and defense, not quick shelter. The main buildings used techniques far more sophisticated than typical trapper cabins. Angus paid particular attention to the ice house. The ice house was a structure designed to preserve ice harvested from the Missouri River during winter. Large blocks were stored inside, insulated to prevent melting through the summer months. Angus examined it carefully. The building had double walls with a gap between them filled with sawdust. The sawdust created dead air space that slowed heat transfer. Ice stored in May remained solid through August. Angus asked the fort carpenter about the design. The carpenter explained that air, when trapped and unable to circulate, was an excellent insulator. Moving air carried heat away. Still, air blocked heat transfer. The sawdust prevented air circulation in the gap between walls. Angus spent an entire afternoon examining a route. Cellar built by a German settler who had briefly worked at the fort before moving on. The cellar used a similar principle. Double doors with an airspace between them. The interior remained cool in summer and didn't freeze in winter because the air gap moderated temperature extremes. He observed water barrels used for washing. Some were single-wall construction. Others had been built with an inner barrel and an outer barrel with straw packed between them. The double-wall barrels kept water from freezing as quickly in winter and kept it cooler in summer. A pattern emerged. Everywhere Angus looked, he found examples of dead airspace being used to control temperature. The principle wasn't new or exotic. Builders had used it for centuries, but nobody had applied it to mountain cabins. Angus purchased supplies, detailed carpenter's tools, including a draw knife, several specialized planes, and a collection of metal brackets. He bought canvas, rope, and small items that most trappers would consider unnecessary luxuries. He spent nearly half his first sale proceeds on these materials. Other trappers at the fort noticed his unusual purchases and asked questions. Angus was vague in his responses. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He simply didn't have clear answers yet. He had observations and theories, but no tested solution. Angus left Fort Union in late May and headed back into the mountains. He didn't return to his old trapping territory. Instead, he traveled to a remote valley he had scouted the previous year, a location with good water, adequate timber, and complete isolation. He needed time to work without interruption or observation. He spent the first week establishing a temporary camp and surveying the local timber. He was looking for specific trees: straight-grained pine for planking, flexible young trees for structural ribs, and dense hardwood for critical connection points. The selection process was meticulous. During this time, Angus continued refining his thinking about cabin design. The double-wall principle from the ice house was clear enough, but simply building a rectangular cabin with double walls seemed inefficient. The structure would require twice as much material and twice as much labor. More troubling was the corner problem. Rectangular cabins had 4 corners. Each corner represented a thermal bridge where the inner wall and outer wall would connect, creating a path for heat to escape. Traditional notched log corners were particularly problematic. They created gaps and connection points that defeated the purpose of dead airspace. Angus began sketching alternatives. He wasn't a trained draftsman, but he could draw basic shapes and work through spatial problems on paper. He drew rectangular cabins with double walls and tried to solve the corner problem. Every solution he conceived either compromised the air gap or required complex construction beyond his capabilities. Then he considered eliminating corners entirely. What if the cabin wasn't rectangular? What if it was round? A round structure would have no corners, no thermal bridges at connection points. The walls would be continuous, an inner circle and an outer circle with airspace between them. The concept was elegant, but presented its own challenges. How would he construct curved walls? Log cabin techniques relied on horizontal stacking, which only worked with straight lines. Angus thought about barrel construction. Coopers built watertight barrels by arranging vertical staves in a circle and binding them with hoops. The technique created curved structures that were remarkably strong. Could the same principle work for a cabin? He sketched a barrel-shaped structure lying on its side, a curved framework covered with vertical planks on the inside and horizontal planks on the outside. The shape would shed snow and rain efficiently. The curve would be self-supporting, distributing weight evenly. And it would allow for complete dead airspace insulation with no corners to compromise the design. The more Angus considered the curved design, the more advantages he saw. A curved roof eliminated the need for separate wall and roof construction. The entire structure would be one continuous shell. The shape provided maximum interior volume for minimum surface area, reducing the total amount of heat that could escape. But the curved design also presented significant construction challenges. He would need to bend wood into ribs, something he had never attempted. He would need to calculate the proper curve radius to create adequate interior space while maintaining structural integrity. He would need to devise a method for attaching planks to curved surfaces. Angus spent June preparing materials. He felled trees and hauled logs to his building site. He stripped bark and began the careful process of splitting planks from straight-grained pine. The work was solitary and methodical. He had no deadline except the approach of winter, and he refused to rush. In early July, 2 trappers passed through his valley. Their names were Duncan MacLeod and a French-Canadian named Remy Fontaine. They were scouting new trapping territory and stopped at Angus's camp out of frontier courtesy. Trappers always checked on isolated camps to ensure no one needed assistance. Duncan examined the materials Angus had collected. He saw the piles of straight planks, the collection of young flexible trees Angus had cut and stripped, and the unusual tools Angus had purchased at Fort Union. Duncan asked what Angus was building. Angus explained his plan: a curved structure, double walls, dead air space for insulation, no corners to leak heat. He showed them his sketches and described the barrel-shaped concept. Duncan and Remy listened politely. Then Duncan asked the obvious question: why not just build a normal cabin and use more firewood? Angus explained about Fergus, about freezing to death with fuel available, about the mathematics of heat loss in rectangular cabins, about the principle of trapped air as insulation. He spoke with the intensity of someone who had spent months thinking about a single problem. Duncan nodded sympathetically, but his expression suggested doubt. Remy was more direct. He said Angus was making the project too complicated. Cabins had been built the same way for generations. The design worked adequately. Angus was wasting time on unnecessary innovation. Angus didn't argue. He thanked them for stopping and wished them well in their scouting. Duncan and Remy left, heading north into the high country. 2 weeks later, Angus encountered another trapper named Wilhelm Krause at a creek where both were fishing. Wilhelm had heard about Angus's building project from Duncan. The story had spread. Wilhelm asked if it was true that Angus was building a cabin shaped like a barrel. Angus confirmed it was true. Wilhelm laughed. He said the other trappers were calling it Quonset's folly. They were saying Angus had lost his mind after his partner died. Some thought grief had broken him. Others thought he was wasting a prime building season on a structure that would collapse under the first heavy snow. Wilhelm wasn't cruel about it. He spoke as a friend offering reality. He suggested Angus reconsider, build a standard cabin, get settled before winter, stop pursuing an idea that wouldn't work. Angus listened without anger. He understood why men doubted. The curved design contradicted everything frontier builders knew. It looked wrong. It required techniques that seemed unnecessarily complex. From the outside, it appeared to be the obsession of a man not thinking clearly. But Angus had done the calculations. He had studied the principles. He knew the physics were sound. The mockery didn't bother him because he wasn't building for approval. He was building to survive. He thanked Wilhelm for the concern and returned to work. By late July, the framework of ribs was taking shape. The curved skeleton rose from the ground like the hull of an overturned boat. Passing trappers saw it and shook their heads. The name stuck: Quonset's folly, the barrel house, McTavish's madness. Angus ignored them all and continued bending wood. The structural framework required precision Angus had never attempted. He needed curved ribs strong enough to support the weight of both wall shells plus snow load, but flexible enough to bend without breaking. The solution was green wood, carefully selected and steam bent into permanent curves. Angus started by constructing a steam box. He dug a fire pit and placed a large water-filled pot over it. Above the pot he built a long wooden box from planks, sealed at the joints with clay. Steam from the boiling water would fill the box. Wood placed inside would heat and soften. He selected young lodgepole pine for the ribs, trees approximately 4 inches in diameter, with minimal taper and straight grain. Each tree was felled, stripped, and cut to 12-foot lengths. Angus needed 14 ribs to create the framework for a structure 16 feet long and 12 feet wide. The bending process required careful timing. Each rib piece went into the steam box for approximately 2 hours. The wood had to heat thoroughly, but not for so long that it became too soft. Angus monitored the process by touch and experience, learning through trial and error. When a piece was ready, he pulled it from the steam box and immediately bent it over a form he had created by driving stakes into the ground in a curved pattern. The hot wood was flexible but fought the curve. Angus had to apply steady pressure, forcing the piece into shape without breaking it. He secured each bent piece with ropes tied to the ground stakes and left it to cool and dry for 3 days. As the wood cooled, the fibers set into the new shape. When released from the form, the piece retained most of its curve, though some springback was inevitable. The first 3 attempts failed. One piece split along the grain during bending. Another cracked where Angus applied too much pressure too quickly. The third looked successful until it dried, then developed a hidden fracture that made it unusable. By the 4th attempt, Angus understood the process better. He learned to feel when the wood was ready. He discovered that bending gradually, pausing to let the fibers adjust, prevented splitting. Over 4 weeks, he successfully created 14 curved ribs. Each one matched the others in radius and curve profile. Consistency was critical. Irregular ribs would create gaps in the wall shells. With the ribs completed, Angus began assembly. He laid out a foundation pattern using stones to mark where each rib would stand. The ribs would be spaced 2 feet apart, creating a strong framework that would support both wall layers. He erected the ribs one at a time, setting the base of each into shallow holes and bracing them vertically. As each rib went up, the structure's barrel shape became more apparent. Angus connected the ribs with horizontal stringers, thin poles that ran the length of the structure on both the interior and exterior sides. These stringers stabilized the ribs and provided attachment points for the wall planking. When the framework was complete, Angus stood back and examined it. The structure looked exactly like an overturned boat hull. It was unlike anything else in the mountains. He understood why other trappers thought it looked wrong. With the framework erected, Angus began installing the inner wall shell. This layer would form the interior living space and needed to be smooth, well-fitted, and capable of holding heat inside the structure. Every gap or irregular joint would compromise the thermal efficiency he was trying to achieve. He had split dozens of planks from straight-grained pine logs over the previous weeks. Each plank measured approximately 6 inches wide, 1 inch thick, and 12 feet long. The edges were shaped using his draw knife until they were straight and true. Consistency in plank dimensions was essential for tight fitting. Angus started at the bottom of the curve on one end of the structure. He positioned the first plank vertically, running from ground level to the peak of the curve. The plank followed the curve of the ribs, and he secured it to each rib using wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. He used pegs rather than nails because pegs wouldn't conduct cold. Metal created thermal bridges. Even small nails could transfer exterior cold directly through the wood. Wooden pegs eliminated this problem while providing adequate structural connection. The second plank went up adjacent to the first. Angus shaped the edge so it fit tightly against its neighbor with no visible gap. This required careful work with his plane, shaving tiny amounts of wood and repeatedly testing the fit. When satisfied, he pegged the second plank in place. The process continued plank by plank. Each one required individual fitting because the curve meant planks on the lower portion of the wall met at slightly different angles than planks higher up. Angus couldn't simply cut identical pieces and install them. Every plank needed custom shaping. The work was slow. He completed approximately 4 planks per day when conditions were good. Rain delayed work because wet wood was harder to shape precisely. His hands developed calluses from the tools, and his back ached from the constant bending and reaching required to work on the curved surface. By mid-August, the inner shell was half complete. Angus could stand inside the curved space and see how the interior would function. The shape created surprising headroom down the center, while the curved walls felt enclosing, but not claustrophobic. The barrel design provided approximately 90 square feet of floor space, slightly less than a rectangular cabin, but adequate for one person. He installed the planking carefully around the door opening, which he had positioned on one end of the barrel. The opening was framed with additional structural members tied into the rib framework. He left space for a door 4 feet tall and 30 inches wide, large enough for entry, but small enough to minimize heat loss. The window opening went on the south-facing side, positioned to capture maximum daylight. It measured only 12 inches square, much smaller than typical cabin windows. Angus designed it small deliberately. Windows were thermal weak points. The smaller the opening, the less heat could escape. As September approached, the inner shell neared completion. The final planks at the peak of the curve required special attention because they had to fit the tightest radius of the bend. Angus shaped these pieces with extra care, creating wedge-shaped planks that filled the remaining gaps and completed the inner envelope. With the inner shell complete, Angus faced the critical question that would determine whether his design succeeded or failed. How wide should the air gap be? Between the two shells? Too narrow, and the dead airspace wouldn't provide adequate insulation. Too wide, and convection currents would circulate air within the gap, carrying heat away from the inner shell. Angus had no engineering tables or scientific references. He had only observation and reasoning. He thought back to the ice house at Fort Union. The sawdust-filled gap between walls had been approximately 8 inches, but sawdust prevented all air movement. His design relied on trapped air alone. He examined natural examples of insulation. Animal fur created dead airspace between individual hairs. The thickness varied by species, but animals surviving cold climates typically had fur 1 to 3 inches thick. Birds fluffed their feathers to create air gaps during cold weather, expanding their insulation layer. Double-pane windows, which Angus had seen in wealthy homes in St. Louis, used air gaps of approximately ½ inch to 1 inch. But those were glass surfaces preventing heat loss from warm buildings. His application was different. Angus considered practical construction limits. A very wide gap would require significantly more lumber for the outer shell and make the overall structure much larger. It would also require longer support members to bridge the gap between shells, adding complexity and cost. He decided to test different widths using a simple experiment. He built 3 small box structures, each with double walls, but different gap widths: 4 inches, 6 inches, and 8 inches. He filled each box with hot water and measured how quickly the water cooled over several hours. The 4-inch gap showed measurable heat loss, though better than a single-wall control box. The 8-inch gap performed only marginally better than 6 inches, suggesting diminishing returns. The 6-inch gap showed optimal performance, maintaining water temperature significantly longer than the 4-inch version, without requiring the extra material of the 8-inch design. Based on these tests, Angus determined his air gap would be 6 inches throughout the structure. This meant his outer shell would follow a curve 6 inches larger in radius than the inner shell, creating uniform dead airspace completely around the living area. He installed spacers between the ribs to maintain the precise 6-inch gap. These spacers were carefully cut blocks of wood positioned at regular intervals. They would prevent the outer shell from sagging inward and compromising the airspace while not creating continuous thermal bridges. The spacers were small, only 3 inches square, and positioned strategically. Angus calculated that their minimal contact area would transfer negligible heat compared to the benefits of maintaining the proper gap width. Each spacer was positioned at rib locations where structural support was needed. With the gap calculated and spacers installed, Angus was ready to begin the outer shell. The design was progressing exactly as he had envisioned, but autumn was approaching, and he still had significant work remaining before winter arrived. The outer shell served different purposes than the inner layer. It didn't need to be smooth or perfectly fitted for appearance. Its job was weather protection and completing the thermal envelope by trapping the air gap. Angus designed it with these priorities in mind. He chose to install the outer planks horizontally rather than vertically. This decision was both practical and functional. Horizontal planks would shed water more effectively, with each plank overlapping the one below like shingles. They would also be easier to install on the curved surface because the curve's radius changed gradually along the length, making horizontal planks more uniform than vertical ones. The outer planks were slightly thicker than the inner layer, roughly 1.5 inches, providing additional strength against weather and physical damage. Angus had split these from dense pine with tight grain patterns that would resist rot and splitting from freeze-thaw cycles. He started at the bottom, installing the first horizontal plank around the entire circumference of the structure. This bottom course sat directly on a foundation of stones he had laid to keep wood off the ground and prevent moisture wicking. The plank was secured to the rib extensions with wooden pegs. The second course went up, overlapping the first by 1/2 inch, creating a weather seal. Angus continued upward, working his way around the structure with each successive course. The installation went faster than the inner shell because horizontal planks required less individual fitting. As he worked, the air gap became enclosed. Angus could no longer see between the shells, but he could feel the difference. When he placed his hand against the outer shell and then against the inner shell, there was no temperature transfer between them. The 6-inch void was doing exactly what he intended, breaking the thermal connection. The curved shape presented one significant challenge for the outer shell. At the peak of the barrel curve, the horizontal planks needed to transition from climbing up one side to descending down the other. Angus solved this by creating a ridge cap, essentially a long curved piece that ran the entire 16-foot length of the structure along the top. This ridge cap was steam bent like the original ribs, shaped to match the peak curve precisely. It covered the gap where the highest planks from each side met and was secured with pegs driven down into the underlying structure. The ridge cap was crucial for weatherproofing. By late September, the outer shell was complete except for the door and window openings. The structure now looked like a massive wooden barrel lying on its side. The horizontal planking emphasized the curved shape and gave it a distinctive appearance unlike any cabin in the territory. Angus walked around the completed shell, examining his work. The structure was solid. The walls showed no gaps or obvious flaws. The curve was consistent and true. From the outside, it was impossible to see evidence of the inner shell or the air gap. The design concealed its own innovation. Other trappers passing through the valley saw the finished structure and continued to doubt. Duncan MacLeod stopped by in early October and admitted the building was well constructed, but questioned whether the curved design would support snow load or whether the unconventional shape would create problems Angus hadn't anticipated. Creating an entrance without compromising the thermal envelope was more complex than Angus had anticipated. A standard door opening would create a massive thermal bridge where cold exterior air could reach directly to the inner shell. The entire point of the double shell design would be defeated if the door opening wasn't solved correctly. Angus studied the problem for 3 days before beginning construction. The opening itself was necessary, obviously. But how could he maintain the air gap integrity while still allowing passage through both shells? His solution was a double-door system with an insulated vestibule between them. The concept was simple but required precise execution. He would build a short tunnel through the wall thickness, essentially a small room within the wall structure itself. The outer door was positioned at the exterior shell surface. It was built heavy and weather-tight, designed to stop wind, rain, and snow. Angus constructed it from thick planks reinforced with diagonal bracing, similar to the door design he had seen on Fort Union's warehouses. The door hung on iron hinges he had purchased at Fort Union, mounted into the structural ribs that framed the opening. The hinges were positioned to swing outward, preventing snow accumulation from blocking the door. Sold. A simple wooden latch secured it from inside. The inner door was positioned 6 inches inward, exactly the width of the air gap. This door was lighter than the outer door because it didn't face weather exposure. Its purpose was thermal sealing. Angus fitted it carefully, leaving minimal gaps around the edges. Between the two doors was the vestibule space, a small chamber approximately 2 feet deep. This space served multiple purposes. It provided room to store tools and equipment where they would remain dry but accessible. More importantly, it created an airlock that prevented direct thermal connection between outside and inside. When someone entered or exited, only one door would be open at a time. The vestibule captured cold air before it reached the inner living space. Heat escaping through the inner door was captured in the vestibule before reaching the outer door. Angus lined the vestibule walls, floor, and ceiling with additional planking, creating complete enclosure. This meant the vestibule itself had its own small air gap on all sides except the door openings. The design essentially created a triple shell system in the entrance area. The construction required detailed carpentry. The door frames had to be built into the structural ribs while maintaining the integrity of both wall shells. Angus used mortise and tenon joints, cutting precise holes in the ribs and fitting shaped frame members into them. He sealed every joint with a mixture he had developed: clay, animal fat, and pine resin boiled together into a thick paste. The mixture remained pliable in cold weather and created an airtight seal around the door frames. When completed, the double-door system added significant thermal protection. Testing showed that opening the outer door caused no temperature change in the interior. Only when the inner door opened did interior warmth escape, and even then, the vestibule space moderated the effect. The doors added 2 weeks to the construction timeline, but Angus considered them essential. A single door, no matter how well built, would have undermined the entire thermal design. With walls and doors complete, Angus faced a paradox. He needed the structure completely sealed to prevent heat loss, but he also needed air exchange to prevent suffocation and remove smoke from the fireplace. Balancing these opposing requirements would determine whether the structure was livable or merely an elaborate death trap. Traditional cabins solved ventilation accidentally through gaps in construction. Air leaked in around doors, through chinking, between roof boards. The leakage was uncontrolled and caused heat loss, but it prevented dangerous carbon dioxide buildup and provided oxygen for fires. Angus's design eliminated those gaps. His careful fitting and sealing meant that almost no air exchange occurred through the walls. This was excellent for heat retention, but created obvious dangers. He needed controlled ventilation that could be adjusted based on conditions. The chimney provided partial solution. Angus had built a stone chimney through the roof at one end of the structure, positioned carefully so it penetrated only the outer shell, passed through the air gap in an insulated channel, then connected to the fireplace inside. The chimney created natural draft, pulling air from the interior and exhausting it outside. This drew fresh air in from somewhere. Angus needed to control where that replacement air entered. He installed 2 ventilation ports, one near the floor at the opposite end from the chimney, one near the roof peak. Each port was a carefully constructed channel through both wall shells with a closable cover. The ports were small, only 3 inches in diameter, but they allowed measured air exchange. The lower port brought in fresh air, which was pulled across the interior space toward the fireplace and up the chimney. The upper port could be opened to increase draft or closed when maximum heat retention was needed. Both ports had interior covers that could be adjusted to control airflow precisely. Angus designed the covers using a sliding plate system. A wooden plate could be moved to cover or uncover the opening partially or completely. The position could be adjusted based on fire size, interior temperature, and outdoor conditions. He tested the system by building a small fire in the completed fireplace. With the lower port partially open and the upper port closed, the fire drew cleanly with no smoke backdraft into the room. Air circulated as designed, in through the lower port, across the interior, up through the fire, and out the chimney. The chimney itself required special attention where it passed through the structure. Angus couldn't allow the hot chimney to contact the inner shell or conduct heat through to the outer shell. He created an insulated channel using a combination of clay and stone that surrounded the chimney but didn't touch it directly. The space around the chimney where it passed through the air gap was left open intentionally. Hot air rising from the chimney could warm the dead air in the gap without creating a direct thermal connection. This incidental heating actually benefited the overall system. For the final sealing, Angus inspected every joint and connection. He applied his clay-fat resin mixture anywhere he detected potential air leakage. The window opening received the same careful treatment as the doors, with seals around the shutters and frame. October brought cold nights to the high country. Angus finished the interior furnishings. A sleeping platform raised off the floor, shelves for supplies, a small table. The structure was ready for occupancy. On October 12, 1842, he moved his gear inside and prepared to test the thermal efficiency he had spent 4 months building. The interior measured approximately 16 feet long by 10 feet wide at the widest point, with headroom of 7 feet down the center. The curved walls created a cozy enclosure that felt larger than the actual square footage suggested. Light from the small window provided adequate illumination during daylight hours. Angus lit his first fire in the stone fireplace. He used a small amount of kindling and 3 split logs, a fire perhaps 1/3 the size he would have built in a traditional cabin. He wanted to measure how little fuel was required to heat the space. The results surprised even him. Within 20 minutes, the interior temperature had risen from 48 degrees to 62 degrees. After an hour, the thermometer read 68 degrees. The fire was burning steadily but not intensely. Angus estimated he was consuming perhaps 10 pounds of wood per hour. He let the fire burn for 3 hours, maintaining a comfortable interior temperature while using minimal fuel. Then he banked the coals and went outside. The exterior temperature was 34 degrees. Inside remained at 66 degrees with no active fire, only banked coals. Angus closed both doors and sealed the ventilation ports except for a small opening at the lower port. He wanted to see how long the structure would hold heat without any fire at all. He spent the night outside in his temporary shelter, checking the interior temperature every few hours. By dawn, the exterior temperature had dropped to 26 degrees. Inside the barrel structure measured 58 degrees. The structure had retained heat for over 12 hours with no active heating source. The thermal mass of the walls and the dead airspace had created exactly the effect Angus had calculated. He relit a small fire. Within 30 minutes, the interior was back to 68 degrees. The fuel consumption was remarkably low. Angus calculated that maintaining comfortable temperature through a full winter day would require perhaps 30 pounds of wood, less than half what a traditional cabin needed. Over the next week, he tested different scenarios: large fire versus small fire, ventilation ports open versus closed, different exterior temperatures. Every test confirmed the design's efficiency. The structure held heat better than any cabin Angus had experienced. The curved shape eliminated cold corners. The dead air space prevented heat loss through the walls. The small, well-sealed openings minimized drafts. The thermal mass of the thick walls absorbed heat during active fires and released it slowly when fires died down. Duncan MacLeod visited during this testing period. Angus invited him inside. Duncan stood in the warm interior, feeling the difference immediately. Outside was near freezing. Inside was comfortably warm, with only a modest fire burning. Duncan touched the interior walls. They were warm to the touch, not cold, like typical cabin walls. Duncan asked about fuel consumption. Angus showed him the woodpile, explaining how little he was burning. Duncan was skeptical until Angus demonstrated, letting the fire die to coals while they talked. The interior temperature dropped only slightly, over 2 hours. Winter came early and hard in 1842. The first major snowfall hit in late October, dumping 2 feet of heavy, wet snow across the high country. Temperatures plunged. By early November, nighttime lows were reaching 20 below zero. Old trappers claimed it was the coldest autumn in memory. Angus settled into his barrel structure and watched the weather worsen. Other trappers in the region were already burning through wood supplies at alarming rates. Every few days, someone would pass through heading to lower elevations, abandoning trap lines because maintaining adequate firewood was impossible while also working. Angus's fuel consumption remained minimal. He burned 1 fire per day, typically in the evening. He would build it up for cooking and warmth, let it burn for 3 to 4 hours, then bank the coals overnight. The structure retained enough heat that interior temperature rarely dropped below 50 degrees, even when exterior temperatures hit 0 or below. The snow accumulation tested the structural integrity of the curved design. By mid-November, 3 feet of snow sat on the barrel roof. Angus watched carefully for signs of stress or sagging. The ribs held firm. The curve distributed the weight evenly. No creaking, no movement. In a traditional cabin, snow on the roof created serious problems. Weight compressed the structure, opening gaps in chinking. Melting snow found those gaps and leaked inside. Ice dams formed at roof edges. Angus's design eliminated these issues. The continuous curve had no edges where ice could dam. The overlapped horizontal planking of the outer shell shed meltwater efficiently. December brought the coldest temperatures Angus had ever experienced. On December 18th, his exterior thermometer showed 34 below zero at dawn. Inside, with only banked coals from the previous night's fire, the temperature was 54 degrees, an 88-degree difference maintained by trapped air and thermal mass alone. Angus relit his fire using minimal kindling. Within 20 minutes, interior temperature rose to 64 degrees. Comfortable warmth with a fire smaller than what most trappers would use just for cooking. He spent the day inside working on equipment repairs while the brutal cold outside continued. Word spread through the scattered trapping community about McTavish's barrel cabin and its impossible warmth. Trappers who had mocked the design in summer were now curious. Some remained skeptical, assuming Angus was exaggerating. Others wanted to see for themselves. Wilhelm Krauss arrived on December 23rd, nearly frozen from traveling 5 miles in extreme cold. Angus brought him into the vestibule, then through the inner door. Wilhelm stood in the warm interior, shocked. He had expected some improvement over standard cabins, but this was different. This was genuinely warm, not just less cold. Wilhelm examined everything. He studied the double-shell construction from inside, looking at where the inner wall met the doorframe. He asked about the air gap width, the ventilation system, the fuel consumption. Angus answered every question, explaining the principles and showing the results. Wilhelm stayed 3 hours, warming himself and watching how the structure performed. He noted that Angus's fire was smaller than what Wilhelm was burning continuously in his own cabin just to prevent freezing. He saw the thermometers showing the dramatic temperature differential. When he left, he told Angus he would build one himself next summer. Duncan MacLeod arrived on January 4, 1843, leading a mule packed with supplies. He had traveled from Fort Union specifically to measure Angus's claims about the barrel structure's thermal performance. Duncan brought precision instruments, 2 matched thermometers calibrated in St. Louis, a notebook for recording data, and healthy skepticism. The exterior temperature that morning was 22 below zero. Duncan hung his thermometer outside the structure next to Angus's existing one. Both read within 1 degree of each other. Verification established, Duncan entered through the double doors. Inside, Angus had a small fire burning. Duncan hung his second thermometer on the interior wall, away from the fireplace. It read 66 degrees. Duncan checked it twice, certain it was wrong. 66 degrees with an exterior temperature of 22 below zero meant an 88-degree differential. Duncan asked Angus to extinguish the fire completely. He wanted to measure how quickly the structure lost heat without any active heating. Angus smothered the fire with ash and closed the flue partially to prevent heat escaping up the chimney. Both men sat inside and watched the thermometer. After 1 hour, interior temperature had dropped to 64 degrees. After 2 hours, 61 degrees. After 4 hours, 56 degrees. Duncan recorded every measurement. The heat retention was extraordinary. A traditional cabin would have dropped to near freezing within 2 hours without fire. Duncan examined the walls from inside, trying to understand the mechanism. Angus explained the dead airspace principle, the 6-inch gap, the minimal thermal bridging. Duncan placed his hand against the interior wall. It was slightly warm, not cold. In a normal cabin, interior walls felt cold because they conducted exterior temperature directly inside. Duncan asked about fuel consumption over a full day. Angus showed his wood supply and explained his burning schedule. 1 fire per evening, lasting 3 to 4 hours. Total consumption approximately 30 pounds of split wood per day in extreme cold. Duncan was burning nearly 100 pounds daily in his standard cabin. The mathematics were undeniable. Angus's structure required 1/3 the fuel to maintain better interior comfort. The savings in labor alone, not having to cut and haul enormous wood quantities, made the design valuable even without considering the improved warmth and safety. Duncan spent 3 days at Angus's camp, measuring and documenting. He tested different conditions, large fire versus small fire, various ventilation settings, different times of day. Every test confirmed the design's efficiency. The structure maintained comfortable interior temperatures with minimal heating. On the 3rd day, Duncan helped Angus build a large fire to see maximum performance. With the fire roaring, interior temperature reached 78 degrees, while outside remained 15 below zero. A 93-degree differential. The structure could be made uncomfortably warm if desired, but such heating was unnecessary. Duncan left convinced. He told Angus the design was revolutionary for mountain living. The fuel savings alone justified the additional construction time. The improved safety and comfort made it even more valuable. Duncan planned to build his own double-shell structure before next winter. Before departing, Duncan asked if Angus planned to share the technique with other trappers. Angus said, anyone who wanted to know was welcome to visit and learn. He had no interest in keeping secrets. The design could save lives. By February 1843, Angus had received 11 visitors, all trappers who had heard about the barrel cabin and wanted to see it themselves. Some came skeptical, certain the stories were exaggerated. Others came desperate, having nearly frozen in their own inadequate shelters and seeking solutions. Angus welcomed everyone. He showed them the construction details, explained the principles, answered questions. Some visitors stayed a few hours, others remained for days, sketching the design and taking measurements. Angus shared everything freely. The visitors fell into 2 categories. Older trappers with years of frontier experience tended towards skepticism. They had built cabins the traditional way for decades. The curved design seemed unnecessarily complex. And the benefits seemed too good to be true. Many left unconvinced despite seeing the evidence. Younger trappers, and those who had suffered through brutal winters, were more receptive. They understood the mathematics immediately. Less wood meant less labor. Better warmth meant better survival odds. The construction difficulty was irrelevant if the result was superior shelter. A French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Moreau arrived in early March with detailed questions about construction techniques. Baptiste had carpentry experience and understood the engineering immediately. He asked about optimal curve radius for different structure sizes, about wood selection for steam-bending ribs, about calculating air gap width. Angus and Baptiste spent a week discussing variations on the design. Baptiste wanted to build a larger structure for a family rather than a single trapper. They worked through the mathematics together, determining that the principles scaled effectively. A larger barrel would require proportionally larger ribs and thicker planking. But the dead air space concept worked regardless of size. Baptiste left with complete plans for a family-sized structure measuring 20 feet long and 14 feet wide. He planned to build near a settlement forming in the Bitterroot Valley, where families were beginning to establish permanent homesteads. By late March, the extreme cold had moderated. Spring was approaching. Trappers began leaving their winter camps to check trap lines and prepare for the spring fur harvest. Many stopped at Angus's camp during their travels, having heard about the barrel cabin through the Frontier Communication Network. The structure had acquired various names in trapper conversations. Some called it the Barrel House. Others called it McTavish's Fortress. A few referred to it as the Quonset, though the mocking tone from the previous summer had disappeared. The name that stuck most commonly was the double shell, a simple descriptive term that captured the essential innovation. Wilhelm Krauss visited again in early April with specific plans. He wanted to build his own structure before next winter and needed to understand the steam-bending process for creating ribs. Angus spent 3 days showing Wilhelm the technique, from selecting proper trees through steaming and forming the curves. Wilhelm asked why Angus was helping potential competitors. Trappers typically guarded advantageous techniques. Angus explained that Fergus Callahan had frozen to death in a standard cabin. If better building methods could prevent similar deaths, sharing the knowledge was obvious. Wilhelm understood. Duncan MacLeod returned to Angus's camp in late May 1843 with a proposal. He had selected a building site 15 miles north and wanted Angus's help constructing his own double-shell structure. In exchange, Duncan would provide labor, supplies, and split the cost of materials that needed purchasing from Fort Union. Angus agreed. He had proven the concept worked. Now he wanted to prove it could be replicated by someone else using the techniques he had developed. If the design required Angus's personal involvement to succeed, it wasn't truly practical for widespread adoption. They spent June at Duncan's site. The location was well chosen, high ground near good water, with abundant straight timber for planking. Duncan had already felled and hauled logs during the spring. The raw materials were ready for processing. Angus taught Duncan the critical techniques: how to select ribs for proper grain and flexibility, how to construct and operate a steam box, how to judge when wood was ready for bending, and how much force to apply. Duncan's first 3 attempts at steam bending failed, just as Angus's early attempts had failed. By the 4th try, Duncan understood the process. The construction progressed faster with 2 men working. Duncan built his structure slightly smaller than Angus's design, 14 feet long and 10 feet wide, adequate for 1 person with storage space. They completed the rib framework in 3 weeks. The inner shell installation went smoothly. Duncan had good carpentry skills and understood the importance of tight fitting. He worked carefully, fitting each plank and checking for gaps. Angus supervised but let Duncan do most of the work. This was Duncan's structure, and he needed to understand every aspect of its construction. The outer shell presented fewer challenges. Duncan grasped the horizontal planking technique quickly. By mid-July, the double walls were complete. They installed the door system using the double-door vestibule design Angus had developed. Duncan added his own innovation, a small covered porch extending from the outer door, providing a dry area for wood storage. The completed structure looked similar to Angus's original, but showed Duncan's individual touches. The curve was slightly different, the proportions adjusted for the smaller size. It was recognizable as the same design concept, but not an identical copy. They tested the thermal performance in late July when a cold front brought unseasonably low temperatures. With a small fire, the interior warmed quickly and held heat for hours after the fire died. Duncan was satisfied. The design worked as promised. Angus left in early August, returning to his own camp. Duncan's successful construction proved the technique was transferable. Other trappers with basic carpentry skills could replicate the design. The innovation was no longer just Angus's personal achievement. It had become a practical building method available to anyone willing to invest the time and effort. Word of Duncan's successful build spread quickly through the trapping community. The double shell design was validated not just by Angus's original structure, but by independent replication. The winter of 1843 to 1844 saw 7 double shell structures built across the northern Rockies. By the following summer, that number had grown to 18. Trappers who had initially mocked the design were now studying it seriously. Some adopted the full barrel curve concept. Others modified it, creating hybrid designs that incorporated the dead airspace principle into more traditional rectangular layouts. The technique evolved as different builders contributed innovations. A Norwegian trapper named Sven Halvorsen developed a method for creating double shell corners in rectangular cabins, solving the thermal bridge problem Angus had eliminated by using curves. A German carpenter named Otto Reinhardt designed adjustable ventilation ports that could be precisely controlled from inside without opening doors. Baptiste Moreau completed his family-sized structure in the Bitterroot Valley in 1844. It measured 22 feet long and 16 feet wide, providing ample space for his wife and 3 children. The larger size required thicker ribs and more substantial framework. But the thermal principles worked identically. Baptiste's family survived the winter, burning half the wood their neighbors consumed in traditional cabins. Angus continued trapping through 1845, but the fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been depleted, and fashion had shifted away from felt hats. Prices for pelts dropped steadily. Many trappers left the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back to civilization. Angus sold his trapping equipment in the spring of 1846 and used the proceeds to purchase land in the Willamette Valley in Oregon Territory. He built a small ranch, raising cattle and horses. He married in 1847 a widow named Catherine Ross, who had come west on the Oregon Trail. They had 2 children. Angus never built another double shell structure. His Oregon ranch used standard construction adequate for the mild climate. But in the mountains he had left behind, his innovation persisted. Trappers continued building double-shell cabins through the 1850s and into the 1860s. When the fur trade ended completely, many mountain cabins were abandoned. But some were discovered and occupied by prospectors during the gold rushes, by hunters, by settlers moving into mountain valleys. The double-shell structures were immediately recognizable as superior construction and were preferentially maintained and occupied. Modern historical surveys have identified remnants of at least 34 double-shell structures in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho that date to the 1840s and 1850s. Most are heavily deteriorated, but the distinctive double-wall construction is still visible. A few have been partially restored and protected as examples of frontier innovation. The trappers never called them McTavish cabins during Angus's lifetime, but historians studying frontier architecture eventually traced the design back to Angus's original 1842 structure and credited him as the innovator. The designation stuck in academic literature, though the structures are more commonly called double-shell cabins or barrel cabins in popular usage. Angus McTavish died in 1873 at age 61 on his Oregon ranch. His death was noted in local newspapers as the passing of a successful rancher and respected community member. No mention was made of his time in the mountains or his contribution to frontier building techniques. The principle Angus McTavish discovered through observation and experimentation is fundamental to modern insulation science. Dead air space, when properly designed and sealed, provides excellent thermal resistance because air is a poor conductor of heat. The effectiveness depends on preventing convection currents that would circulate air and transfer heat through movement rather than conduction. Angus's 6-inch air gap was nearly optimal for the materials and construction methods available to him. Modern testing shows that air gaps between 4 and 8 inches provide maximum insulation value in similar applications. Narrower gaps allow too much conductive heat transfer. Wider gaps permit convection currents that reduce effectiveness. The curved design eliminated thermal bridges, points where materials conduct heat directly from interior to exterior. Every corner in a rectangular structure creates a thermal bridge. Angus's barrel shape had no corners and minimal connection points between shells. This reduced heat loss by an estimated 40 to 60% compared to traditional log construction. The actual temperature differential Angus achieved, maintaining interior warmth 54 degrees or more above exterior temperature with minimal heating, is consistent with modern insulation calculations. A well-sealed, double-shell structure with 6-inch dead airspace provides an R value of approximately 15 to 20, depending on materials. This level of insulation, combined with thermal mass from thick wooden walls, explains the documented performance. Traditional 1840s log cabins had R values of perhaps 3 to 5. They leaked air extensively, and their corners created thermal bridges. Angus's design represented a 4 to 6-fold improvement in thermal efficiency. The fuel savings were correspondingly dramatic, reducing wood consumption by 60 to 75% for equivalent interior comfort. The technique's broader impact is difficult to quantify precisely, but frontier mortality records suggest improved winter survival in regions where double-shell construction was adopted. Fewer deaths from exposure and cold-related illness were recorded in areas where the building method spread, though many factors influenced these statistics. Modern historians estimate that Angus's innovation, along with subsequent variations developed by others, may have saved dozens of lives over the following decades. The exact number is unknowable because survival often goes unrecorded. But the technique demonstrably improved living conditions for frontier populations in extreme climates. The story of Angus McTavish and his impossible barrel cabin illustrates how practical innovation emerges from necessity. He wasn't trained as an engineer or architect. He was a trapper who watched his partner freeze to death and refused to accept that outcome as inevitable. He studied, experimented, and built something genuinely new using existing materials and simple tools. His willingness to share the technique freely ensured its spread and refinement. Had he attempted to monopolize or profit from the innovation, it would likely have died with him. Instead, it became part of the collective knowledge of frontier builders, adapted and improved by dozens of others. The double-shell cabins scattered across the northern Rockies stand as testament to what observation, reasoning, and determination could accomplish on the American frontier. They represent innovation born not from theoretical science, but from lived necessity. And they remind us that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come from refusing to accept that the old way is the only way.